Today we are so honored to have somebody very, very special talking to us. And I would ask, I think Rita asked this in the last time that she spoke, that you get your notebooks out and that you make some notes, because Fasiha Hassan is an absolutely phenomenal young woman. She is a lawyer and a politician. She was a student activist and the SRC leader during the Fees Must Fall protest, right in the beginning at WITS in 2015. In May 2019, at the age of 25, she became the youngest member of the Gauteng Provincial Legislature. She's the whip of the ANC Gauteng Political Education and Development Caucus Executive. And in 2019, she was nominated for the Student Peace Prize, a Norwegian prize awarded to student activists dedicated to non-violent social justice. We are so lucky to have her with us. You understand how incredibly busy she is. So thank you for joining us today, Fasiha, and welcome, and please go ahead.
Thanks for having me, Val, and hi to everybody. I think I should first, I'm so excited. When I was on the discussion sort of prep session with Val, I said, I'm so happy to be speaking to students and to young women. It really wasn't that long ago. I think I'm still studying now. I'm doing my master's. So this is an incredible crowd. I'm very excited to do it. So yeah, my name is Fasiha Hassan. I've been introduced and they've sort of mentioned a little bit about what I do now and what I've done then. And I'm actually very glad to be talking about negotiation. And I think you've heard around the technicalities of it. So I'm going to speak a little bit more about my actual experience, my life experience, and then sort of try and tie it into what you've already been learning and sort of going through. So yeah, I started off as a student activist at WITS University, and I was somebody who was very involved even before SRC, sort of in student politics and getting a little bit into what sort of goes on, right? And I think we all know this. The university space tends to be one that is actually quite overwhelming, especially from in a first year situation, and even, to be honest, even in second and third year, it's quite overwhelming. You have very demanding academics, you have all these social sort of obligations and responsibilities, you're trying to do your best, and being a woman in the space, there's all of these issues are also around over-sexualization, and we'll talk about that, but it's a lot. It really is a lot. And very often people think that this idea of negotiation is a very formalistic one, is one that's reserved for politicians, for lawmakers, for corporates. You think it's like a UN thing, etc. And in reality, with everything that's been said, I know Val said it, everybody said it, you do negotiate every day. We may not call it negotiations, but you balance different interests and different ideas and different people all the time. And one of the things that I always think about when trying to unpack negotiation is I think about it like in a formal sense, which I'll speak to, but also an informal way. How many times have we been hanging out with friends and there's different ideas about where you should go, which place should you go out to, and you realize, oh, I'm not really into this place, or I don't like the music, or I don't like the vibe, but all your friends are very interested in going there, and small things like that, you negotiate it, right? Which restaurant to eat at, which place to hang out at, even often sort of just generally in your social circle. So you got to think about it, I think, a little bit more broadly. And I think what's really important from here is just taking the skills, which are things that you often do, but you maybe don't think about all the time. But yeah, I want to talk a little bit about a few examples in which I've been in difficult situations and had to negotiate, and talk about some of the options that were available, and then some of the things that happened. Some worked out well, some didn't work out that well. And that's also what I want to show you, that not every example is one you're going to walk out with everything that you want. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a negotiation. It would just be something where you take everything. So yeah, the first one is, and this is something that may be relatable to people. When we were in the SRC, a lot of people tend to go through what we call academic exclusion. So you go through university space, it's really difficult to perform for some students, academically speaking, for a number of reasons. You get, sort of ranges from people who party too much vis-a-vis people who didn't have access to textbooks, didn't have access to accommodation, had to sleep in a library, had to sleep in a bathroom. That's something I've experienced. A girl who came to me who said, I don't have accommodation, I'm sleeping in a bathroom. And, sort of all these different things. And a lot of the students just can't perform well academically. And then at the end of the year, you find yourself in a situation where you're sitting at a table having to represent all these students to a university committee who's saying, well, why should we let them back? And I cite this example because, you know, we spoke now about the role play of the extension on the assignment. That's one thing that you'll come into. But sometimes the stakes are a bit higher. And sometimes you're in a situation where the university will say, well, we have 17,000 applicants for this particular course. Let's say electrical engineering, let's say humanities, let's say law. I studied law. Why should we let this particular student back? And it was a situation in which we had to balance the negotiation between representing the student and trying to get the student back, but also acknowledging that some of those cases were not clear cut. So some people will go through that process and think, well, I have to get back to university, I have to get back, when in reality, it may not be the best thing at that moment. And I'm going to give you a very particular example. We had a student whose mother, I think it was, mother or father, but mother who had passed away, and going through the absolute most emotionally, unable to perform academically, you know, just really had to keep going home, up and down, look after the family. And we had to come to a very sort of difficult negotiation, not just with her, but with the university, in which we said, well, if we do let her back in and she fails again, there's no third chance. This is the chance that she would have gotten. And it was something where we had to balance with her, make her understand, and sort of also say to the university, well, maybe the best thing for the student is to take some time off, to heal from the loss, to find a situation where there's stability at home and come back the following year to study at the university. And I'm using this example because, of course, there were many, in fact, we had a 80% success rate. We got most students back. But there were some situations where it wasn't that easy. And one where we had to say, well, there are moments in which you have to compromise for the longer term, where you have to look at the bigger picture and say, well, what am I going to achieve today versus what am I going to achieve a year from now? What am I going to achieve 5 years from now? Or even smaller than that, what am I going to achieve next week, next month, etc. And I want to put this in your mind because you need to remember that all negotiation in many ways is like, you're playing out a scenario in your mind. What's going to happen if I do this? What's going to happen if I do that? And sometimes you have to make difficult decisions and you have to balance difficult interests, but ultimately, because in the long run, it's the right thing to do. So that's one example of where I've encountered very difficult negotiations. But there was another one, and you'll probably know better about this one. Fees Must Fall. We started it in 2015. It continued on into 2016. And we were in a situation where the university at the time was trying to put forward a 13% fee increment. And I need not tell anyone in this call how expensive university fees are. Some people are on NSFAS, some people are lucky to have scholarships, but not everybody is, and especially not at that time. There were even fewer people who were funded. And we obviously tried everything. We negotiated at the boardroom. We did research. We put across all of these different case studies around students and what they would lose, etc., etc. And ultimately, that was a failed negotiation. We did everything we could in our power to try and have sort of a meeting of minds, which in some ways negotiation is. But there were some things that we couldn't compromise on. And that's what I want you to take from this example here. When you're negotiating, when you're looking at yourself, if you remember the you example, right? You, yourself, others understanding, you need to know where you stand on certain issues as a person. Where are the things that you are willing to negotiate or sort of compromise on? And where are the things that you know are just fundamentals? You can't go against these fundamentals. And in that situation in which we were student leaders, our fundamental thing was we couldn't leave poor students behind. We absolutely couldn't. This was one thing that we could not compromise on, one thing that we were not willing to negotiate on, one thing that we said, this is the make or break. And not all negotiations have a make or break. I think you have to weigh out like I said, the first one, what's the bigger picture? What's at stake here? I can lose an argument or a negotiation with a friend about having pizza vis-a-vis having burgers. That's different. But when the negotiations are higher stakes, let's say about your career, let's say a relationship with a person, where you're not comfortable about the, nature of the consent or your sexual sort of experience with that person. Those are very high stakes, I would think. And you have to know where you're willing to compromise on and where you're willing to not. And so we were not willing to allow a situation in which students, poor students who didn't have textbooks, who weren't funded, who were sleeping in libraries, whose only crime in this world, crime, was to have been born poor. There's no way we were going to leave them behind. And so as much as we put across this research, as much as we tried to find this meetings of minds, we did different scenario planning, we did all of these things, we couldn't compromise on that one thing. And the university couldn't compromise on what they felt was their financial interests. They felt that they needed that money to run the university, even though we had presented a case study in which we said the increment they were asking for was too high. So we weren't necessarily initially arguing that there should be no increment. We were saying that it shouldn't be as high as it was, because over the last 5 to 10 years, it had been increasing by more than 10% every year. But ultimately, that negotiation collapsed. And we then had to say to ourselves, well, what do we have left? What tools do we have left? And it came down to a situation in which we said, well, we're going to protest. But we made a decision then not to protest in a necessarily traditional sense, right? Normally people would sing struggle songs, you hand over a memorandum, and that's kind of it. We had different ideas around how we were going to show the university at the time how important this was. Now, this is where I'm trying to show you there was the formal negotiations in the boardroom, but those negotiations spilled out into real life. And we needed to show the university that there would be thousands of students who would be left behind if they forced this fee increase through. And that's when we decided we would physically block the gates of the university, right? We were going to show that the doors of learning would be physically shut because they couldn't afford the fees, right? Because you wouldn't be able to come back and study, because you shouldn't be getting an education that you can afford. You should be getting the education you deserve. And so when we, on the 14th of October 2015, we woke up early in the morning, we got to the university, we literally sat in front of the gates, 11111, and we were very few people. We were maybe 15 people. And it was tough. It was very, very tough. But we were able to make that decision and hold our ground because we knew where we were willing to compromise and where we were not, and what was really at stake and what was important to us. And in that action, you know what happened. It grew very quickly. We started off as 15, maybe 20 people. Within a few hours, we were a few hundred people. Within a few days, we were a few thousand. And what we were able to show the university and show the higher education space and every single vice chancellor in the country, that just because we were young and just because we were not necessarily equal at the sort of equal bargaining power at the table didn't mean that we should be taken any less seriously. And that's also something I want to talk about now, power dynamics in negotiations. Often you'll find that because you're young and because you're a woman, people will undermine you. They will. And it takes a lot of yourself, a lot of hard work, and a lot of changing of the system to actually equalize those playing fields. So when we were in the university negotiating boardroom, we were 1 or 2 students out of, let's say, 25 of the board of council. And even though we made compelling arguments, and even though the research held, which we now know it held, right, because there was positive outcomes afterwards, they were able to drop that increment and they were able to say, well, actually, that was far too high. What seemed to matter more was that we were just students. We were just young people there. We were just, they thought they could just brush us aside. And that's where you also need to understand that not all negotiations or all examples of negotiations, you're going to be in a position where you have the power to necessarily be that bigger player. But that doesn't mean that you aren't able to speak at the table. It doesn't mean that you're not able to be a fundamental part of the decision making. It means that we need to think creatively. It means that we need to use what makes us great as young people to sort of turn it on its head. And that's what we did during Freeze This Fall. We knew we were not going to win that battle in the boardroom. We tried, we did everything we could. We followed the guidelines, the steps that you would follow. We knew that wasn't the case. And so we brought that negotiation to a space where we forced them to listen to us. And that was quite literally outside of that elitist boardroom and onto the ground and onto, a space in which students were the most important stakeholder of that discussion about fees. Remember, there's no university without students. And often I think people forget about this, right? We think that it's only about the infrastructure. We think it's only about the academics. We think it's about the image of a university. But in reality, there is no university, college, school, etc., that exists without us as young people. And what I was talking about now around these power dynamics, we had spent months in this boardroom doing everything that we can. But on the Friday, that first Friday of Fees Must Fall, I don't know, I think people may have been in high school still then, but those wouldn't, they'll be aware that we entered into a negotiation with the university. Except this time the negotiation wasn't on the 11th floor in an administrative building away from the people who stood to lose the most. It was in what we now call Solomon Mahlangu House Concourse, with thousands of students behind us. And all of a sudden, what had happened was, instead of us speaking for students in a boardroom all the way 11 floors up, there was a student who could say to the chairperson of council, that res increment that you put forward meant that I had to move out of university res into a South Point, into shitty accommodation where I'm not getting value for money, or where I had to crash on someone's floor because of the decision that you made. And it showed those people at the negotiating table that their decisions are not academic, they're not statistical, they affect real people. They affected human beings, young people like you and me, who didn't have that voice inside of that boardroom. So it's also about finding ways in which you get your voice heard. And it's not always simple. This is obviously a very particular example, but it's about looking at what you're good at and what you have to offer and how you utilize that to your benefit. So if you're good at research, if you're good at speaking, if you're good with people, or if, let's say you're a bit shy, but you know how to write, or you know how to, bring something else to the table, find a way to utilize that when you're at that negotiating table, because that's going to be something that you can use to level the playing fields. And one of the last things I want to say on this, because I think it's also important, one of the only things we had during Fees Must Fall to negotiate with, well, let me start here. As students, we don't have a lot of money. We don't have jobs. We're not employed. Some people might be, but it's often part-time employment. It's not the end goal. What we have is society's need for us to graduate, and society's need for us to be skilled graduates, to contribute to the economy, etc., etc. What we had and what we have is the academic program. That's what we had to negotiate with. And so we fast realized that in the negotiating room, we didn't have power because it was one or two student voices versus 25. And what the chairperson of council was like, okay, let's take this to a vote. And while that sounds like a democratic thing to do, if the power dynamics are off, of course we were going to lose the vote. We were 2 people versus 25. So even though we had a good argument, even though we were fighting for the right thing, we had to change it on its head and bring them to where we had the power, which was the academic program, right? Which is what we had stopped, what we had paused, and what we had said, until you come and listen to what we're saying and actually take what we're saying seriously, we're not going to compromise on that. Now this, of course, and I want to be clear, is an extreme example. You're not going to encounter this type of negotiation all the time, but there will be times in your life where you have to, where there'd be a promotion at work. And here's a very good example. And I've read a lot about this. As women, we are often paid less. The sort of gender pay gap is very, very big, especially in a space like South Africa. And one of the mistakes we make, and I'm still learning it myself, is that we don't negotiate hard enough for ourselves because we doubt ourselves. We think that they owe us something, that we should prove ourselves. Of course you must prove yourself, of course you must work hard, but you also need to know your worth and know that you are deserving of more. The honest truth, you saw that I'm called a whip of political education and caucus. I'm not getting paid for that. Let me be honest with you. I'm going to share this with you. At the beginning of the term, the chief whip spoke to me. He said there are 73 public reps, 73 MPLs. We do qualify for 80, but until Parliament puts through a bill, we only can pay 7 whips, and you're the 8th whip. And I'm having the same dynamic now, because I was taken aback at the time in which he didn't say it formally, he didn't set up a meeting, he pulled me aside and said, this is the situation. And because I'm unlearning this thing right now, like today, like in this process, that I deserve better. I will do the work and I will put in everything that I've got and I will really make this thing work and it will be successful. But I also deserve to be paid for it. And I must be unapologetic about it. And so for the last few weeks, I've been thinking very deeply about how I'm going to bring it forward. And I want to share this with you because there's no clear-cut example. There's no like easy way out of this one. I need to bite the bullet, set up the meeting and say, well, Chief Whip, I deserve more. I'll do the work, I'll do it, but I deserve more. And that's something that I want, especially because in the next year, few years, you're going to be in the workspace and you're going to have to do the same thing. And let me tell you one last thing. People negotiate their salary contracts all the time. Let's not be those people like, oh, wow, I've got a job and just sign. Yes, if it's your first job, you can do that. But if there's a promotion or you know that you're being undervalued, speak up, say something about it. Because the more we don't, and the more we keep quiet, the more we settle for less. And the more generations that come after us will also have to settle for less. So just remember, you're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for many, many, many women who are going to come after us as well. Well, I know that might be my time, and I know people are going to ask questions, so I don't want to mess that up. And I've got content, but yeah, I think it might come up in the questions as well. Oh, can't hear you.
I'm sure there are lots of questions. Thank you so much for that. You really touched on so many important points there that I'm going to ask C on the floor who would like to ask some questions. Thank you, guys. Rivka, are you clapping? Sorry. Anybody would like to ask something? Ladies, you will not get the opportunity to. Charmaine?
Yes. To ask a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Oh, I wanted to ask, how do you deal with the awkwardness or treatment you receive after negotiating, maybe with the boss at work for promotion? Like, how do you make sure that the mood of the relationship stays the same, even after negotiating for what you want and you didn't get what you want?
Did you get
I'm done.
I think I got it. It was about sort of how you deal with being received potentially negatively. Is that, Charmaine, was that your question?
Yes, that's the question.
Yeah. One of the things you're going to have to learn very quickly, and I'm sure you've already started to experience this, is the moment you stand up for yourself, especially as a woman, you're going to get called names. It's part of this very patriarchal idea that because we know what we want and because we're confident, you'll be called aggressive, you're going to be called a bitch, you're going to be called a whole lot of things. But it goes down to what we were saying earlier, right? And what Val was presenting. You need to know who you are and know what your intentions are as well. And if you know that this is something that you've worked hard for, something you deserve, and something that you're qualified to do as well, then you shouldn't be as unapologetic. There will be some fallout. There will be. But it's also your approach that's important. And that's why this thing of negotiation is important, right? Needing to understand where you're willing to compromise, where you're not willing to compromise, and where you're also starting to say, well, this is something that I can see. And you need to kind of think about that before it, right? So I would be, if I'm in the situation, and I've been thinking about this for a while, if I bring it up to my boss, who is the chief whip, he could say, yeah, that's actually quite true. I acknowledge what you're saying, but here's the reality of the matter. And this is likely what he's going to say. It's COVID-19. There's not enough funding. How do we justify giving you inverted commas increase at a time like this? So I need to have an answer for that, because that's a very good point. I can't pretend that there aren't difficult conversations that need to be had. But then I also need to say, well, Chief Whip, then I can't do all this work because the time that I utilize for this means it's time I'm not working in the community, which is my actual job, right? The things that I'm actually paid to do. This is my mandate as an elected person. And then I need to balance it out and play it out. But the fact is, he'll know where I stand on the matter. And when the time comes, even if it's a year from now or 2 years from now, he knows that this is something I need to push on. And also that something I found works well. It's also, you work hard and you prove yourself. So by the time you have that conversation with someone, they've acknowledged that you're also deserving of it, that you have something to bring to the table and that you have that potential. But it's definitely, it could go very wrong. It could be, and you also need to be prepared for that, because that's also life. In the real world, things don't always work out. In the real world, you're going to have to take quite a few punches, very hard punches. And you're going to have to be able to pick yourself up and figure out, well, right, this is something I can lose, or something this is I'm going to have to put my foot down about. And that's something only you can really determine in the situation.
Nice. Nikita, you had a question?
I wanted to ask, what is the most difficult situation or challenging situation that you had to negotiate for yourself, and whether it worked or didn't work, what did you learn from it?
Yeah, most difficult one. And I'm glad you asked it, because I had it written down here. It's something I shared in a previous G4G session in a different cohort, in a different group. At the end of 2015, or around November of 2015, the former president had announced that they would freeze all the fee increments, and they were putting together this commission that would investigate the feasibility of free education, right? And so we had come back. We hadn't exactly gotten what we wanted. There was no increment, sure, but we knew that the fees were not affordable even before that increment, right? So the greater goal was around opening up access to higher education. And we were faced with a very, very difficult situation. On the one hand, we were close to losing the academic year, right? Which meant no teachers, no doctors, no dentists, no engineers. There'd be nobody, okay? Remember, we're talking national now. There would be no graduates. So that's the one side we were looking at. The other side that we were looking at is we hadn't exactly won all of our demands. And the other big demand that hadn't been won yet was the fight against outsourcing of workers, right? So workers who were employed by a third party, who were very badly treated by those third party companies. That was a big part of our demands. So this side we had, and I'm going to tell you real life stories. Fourth year engineering students, civil engineering, black male, poor background, like rural background. Progressive guy, he was with us in the protests. Pulls me aside one day and says, but Fasiha, the truth is, I have to graduate. I have to finish this degree. There are people at home who are relying on me to get a job so they can have food on the table next year, I have to build a house for my mom. I have to do all of these things. And it doesn't mean I'm not pro free education. It doesn't, and that was the truth. It doesn't mean we don't believe in this goal any less. It meant that we were faced with immediate dire need. And also, remember, the economy can't function without this intake of skilled people, right? It's not going to work. We need architects, we need engineers, we constantly need these people to build the economy and to build society. So that was the one thing. And many students were of that same example. I mean, I'm not talking about privileged students who, just wanted to go back to class. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about genuine poor students who were with us, but who really the stakes were too high. And then, of course, there was Ubaba and Umama, who were cleaners, landscapers, etc., who were saying, but we also are fighting for dignity, and we're also fighting for equal pay, fair pay, etc. So how do you choose? And the difficulty, and I always reflect on this, is we were 21 at the time in which we had to make this decision. And there was no right or wrong, if you can see. There was a very difficult negotiation that had to happen, both internally and externally. And ultimately, what we had to decide was that we had to allow exams to happen so that these poor students could be able to look after their families, grandparents, mothers, fathers, etc., but continue to fight against the end of for the end of outsourcing on this side as well. But we came under severe criticism from different sides. The very, very, very far left were like, you guys shouldn't have done that. But they were not on the ground. They were not the ones who directly represented students or were actually the ones who were dealing with this, okay? And by the way, the end of outsourcing came. It came about 2 weeks later, but we had no idea. We were just faced with these two incredibly difficult situations. And when I look back, obviously with the benefit of hindsight, you can make anything happen differently. But with the information that we had at the time, I think we did the right thing. we did not lose the academic year, but at the same time, we managed later on to win this battle against outsourcing. But I just want you to see how it's tough. And sometimes there isn't a right answer. And sometimes there's like a more right way to do it, but you won't know that until after. So you need to be able to trust in yourself and in the information that you have before you to say, well, this is what I'm going to have to do. I know it doesn't entirely answer your question, but it's the most honest I can be.
Thank you, Fasiha. Alice, you had a question.
I think my question was slightly answered, but I have two questions. The first one was, so in a negotiation situation where outside of fees must fall, say in a personal space, where you can see that there's no win-win situation, in terms of the fees must fall, the solution was taking the fight to the ground. However, in a personal space, how do you handle that when you see that you are not going to get what you want from the negotiation, even whether it's a compromise? And do you let go of that, or do you continue fighting? How exactly do you deal with that in a much more personal space? And then my second question is, in terms of fees must fall, was the fight, was it solely fees and just outsourcing of workers, or there was also an inclusion of free decolonized education? And if so, where's the decolonized part now in terms of negotiation and the outcomes of that? What were the improvements that were done in terms of that? But if we look at the outsourcing that was stopped, and in terms of free education, the increment was not, fees did not increase. But in terms of the decolonized aspects of it, what was done?
All right, let me start with the second question first. Remember, the demand has always been for free, quality, decolonized education. And that's a fundamental part. I think I just didn't bring it in, because it was more particular around the initial negotiations. But it was and is a fundamental part. And if you recall, that's actually what triggered Rhodes Must Fall, which ultimately laid the pathway for what later we know now as fees must fall. The decolonization one is interesting because I think we won more battles on that, in theory, than we did on the fees, because those ones are more intangible, so to speak. So if you think about decolonization, it's about turning the system over. It's about saying that the system as it is not conducive and was never designed to educate people of color in a way that is empowering. So we identify different elements of this decolonization process. The one was a very particular thing, the institutional naming, statues, etc. And I'll speak to where we won a few battles there. But the second one is also around like language policy, the culture of your university, which is, I think, still the hardest one that we haven't really been able to put a proper dent in. But there's different elements. And of course, there's like decolonizing the curriculum and the academic one. And so what we managed to do in this process was force even the terminology of decolonization onto the agenda. And we won some significant battles in terms of how curriculum is developed, at least at WITS in particular. That it's a more inclusive process, that it's one that includes the narratives of the African continent. And it was easier to do in a situation like the humanities, which I think you're starting to see it in. Reading lists, I know by the time I did delict, or I don't know, I can't remember which law subject I did. By the time I did it, it was sort of post fees must fall. And we started to see Biko's writings in the reading list, the recommended, or not even the compulsory reading list. So we were starting to already see those things. But this process of negotiation was also difficult in a slightly different sense, because it wasn't a monetary discussion, it was a cultural sort of discussion. So I remember very particularly sitting in a naming committee meeting. We were fighting, so there's this building called Senate House, which is where we would always gather during Fees Must Fall, which we now know is called Solomon Mahlangu House. And I was putting forward the proposal to rename the space to Solomon Mahlangu House. And I remember very clearly presenting, you write this proposal, you do the lobbying, you get all the signatures, this was like our thing. This was like us starting this sort of formalistic process of decolonizing the university. And there was an alumni on the board with us, or on the committee with us, old white man. And I make the case because it's not just about Solomon House. There's Barney Bonato, there's a university race called Barney Bonato, and he was contemporaries with Rhodes and, all these guys. And so I'm making these arguments about why it's important and why we have to change the names and why it's not just about a name, why, there's this lack of or indignity that one feels, etc. This man sort of in the meeting gets up and very elaborately waves his hands, because we're on the top floor of one of the admin buildings and you can have this big view of Joburg. He elaborately does this with his hands and he says, Barney Bonato and Rhodes built this city. There'd be no city without these guys. And I almost completely lost my shit in that meeting. In fact, the now DVC had to sort of hold me because I was about to stand up, because he also stood up, it was about to be a bit of a screaming match. And it was in that situation where I realized that this thing of decolonization is going to hit hard in certain spaces, but we need to continue fighting for it. But what I want you to be aware of is we didn't just fight for the name change. We had gone through this proposal, we had done the research, we put together a very well thought out, well endorsed proposal. It wasn't just something that we just sort of thought about, and I keep saying this because people forget. They see the outcomes and they see what they saw on TV and they think, oh, this equaled that. But it completely passed over this part, right? Which is what I'm trying to show you, and how we actually got to where we were. And your second question, it's difficult to answer because, you need a more specific example. But, in the workplace or in any space, let me do it like this. Let me answer generally. It's useful to identify allies, okay? People who you may relate to, or people who may just understand things from your perspective. I say this because in any negotiation, it's not just you, there are other people involved and there are other interests. And often some of those people can raise your interest in a way that is more objective and in a way that could potentially get more success. But of course, it depends on the matter, right? They could even support you when you start talking or start actually putting across the issue. And also identifying, and now this is the politician in me, okay? So I want you to take this with a slight pinch of salt. But you need to also understand that everybody has something that they want or something that they wish to gain in their interest. And it's also important to identify that, because if that is something where you can do a give and a take, and I'm not talking, I'm not at all saying there must be corrupt activity or money, none of that. What I mean is that in any negotiation, even with your friends, when you're choosing a place to go out to, you know that your friend might want to go to this particular club because their ex tends to frequent it, for example, right? There might be some of those sorts of elements. And you can use that information to your benefit and your advantage and say, well, actually, so-and-so, we know why you want to go here. And actually, that's not a good idea because you're likely to bump into your ex and it's going to be a dramatic evening for all of us. And, we just want to have a good time. Let's rather go here. So see what I've done there, right? We've utilized information that we have for the benefit of the negotiation, but ultimately everyone's also going to have a good night because there's not going to be drama and awkwardness, etc. So that's, yeah, it's not the example you were putting across, but it's just something I thought I could use to explain.
Wonderful example. Thank you for that. Did anyone else have any other questions? Yes, Nkobile.
I'm sorry, this has been burning me. I just want to know from you, with all the things that you're doing, what is the why behind the what? You've done a number of game-changing things in my perspective, and I'm sure you'll go on to do more. But what is this thing that's driving you behind all of that you're doing?
Thanks. The simple thing, or the simple answer, and it sounds really corny and cheesy, and that's why I don't like to give the simple answer on its own, is that the world is a messed up place. Things are not fair. And if we can do something about it, we should. That's the simple answer. But the longer, more complicated answer is also that those things that I've seen, they can't sit well with us, right? when you see a beggar at the corner of a street or at a traffic light, or you see a student who doesn't have a textbook, or a student who spends all night in a computer lab because they don't have access to Wi-Fi or a laptop, or, you know, and you do have those things, that's not something that can ever sit well in your heart, you know. And I know it sounds very idealistic and utopian, but the truth is I am an idealist. I have to believe that we can do this. I have to believe that we can change the status quo. Because if we don't even try, then why are we even here? You know, I want to be able to say, and this is also part of my, like, I'm a Muslim, you know, it's part of, and it's also something that you see in lots of Abrahamic religions, right? This idea of judgment from God, or the day of judgment. And for me, I want to be able to say, whenever that time comes, and God sort of says to me, what did you do with this life that I gave you? I want to be able to list things and say, but this is what I did. This is where I try to make the world a better place. And we will sometimes fail, and sometimes we will lose, and sometimes we will win. But I just need to know that I did everything that I could to make it better and to push a collective interest. So it sounds really corny, I know, but it's how I feel, and it's also what motivates me to keep going, even when I'm like exhausted and I want to give up. Because for me, this is not just a job. It's activism is a lifestyle. You know, it should be in every fabric of what we do. And when you live that way, you also start to see like good things come toward you as well. So yeah, that's the long and the short of it.
Such a beautiful answer. Thank you for that, Fasiha. Anybody else have any questions?
Hi, Val. Thank you so much, Fasiha. If I may just, there's one additional point I'd like to make. I think, because I'm looking at the chat box and what is happening over there, I wanted to point out that the U framework is actually a chronology. You start with yourself. You need to know what it is you're negotiating for. And Fasiha, for example, said, know what your negotiables are and what your non-negotiables are. And then you consider the other side. And it's because someone asked a question, you know, whether to take a salary and it's your first job. You need to know why you're asking for that. So the why or you framework happens in that chronology. You know what your strengths are, your position of strength. And Fasiha has told us where you get your position of strength from. It's by knowing your mission and continuously reinforcing it. And then you can say, okay, then what does the other person want? What are they negotiating for? Then the you is a continuous back and forth. You now get what they're saying, you compare it to what your negotiables are or your non-negotiables, and then it goes back and forth. And I thought it's important that we understand the framework is not a standalone like a Y, an O, and a U. It's something that continuously happens, but it happens in that chronology. It starts with you, the individual, by defining what it is that you want. But brilliant presentation, Fasiha, and thank you so much for speaking to the YOU framework.
Thank you, Rita. Anybody else have anything else they would like to ask?
I'm also just checking the chat box, because I actually didn't check that properly before.
Don't worry, I've been watching it. It's okay. Kensani, you have a question.
Yeah, I do have a question. My question to the speaker is, where is your emotional health in the midst of the negotiation? Where is your mental health? Because such things can take a toll on you. So how do you balance that?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, I think initially we didn't at all think of mental health, and that was a mistake. You tend to think that you'll just be okay, and you don't quite realize that some negotiations take more out of you than others. And it's also what I was saying earlier, some of those high stakes negotiations are often ones in which you have so much to lose and so much to gain that you don't quite look at the mental health aspect. It's difficult for me to answer this because I don't think I've given enough attention to it, to be quite honest. And it's only something that I'm trying to watch now. And one of the things I've tried to do, because also, like we said, we negotiate on a daily basis, is also to create boundaries, right? So I often have lots of people who constantly, like, you know, when you feel like an octopus and you're pulled in all different directions and everybody wants a piece and talk, and you know, I've had to put in boundaries and say, well, what is the value of me spending my time on this thing? What's the outcome? And negotiate it through that. So, for example, I will, and it's something I've said to Val and Teresa before, I see immense value in the Girls for Girls, the G4G program, right? In empowering other young women. So I will find time, regardless of what's going on, to put into it, because it's not just about my mental health. It's something that I enjoy doing. It's something I love doing. I want to empower more and more young women. But then there are also like people who just, and comrades who just want to squabble and talk factional nonsense politics. And that's not something that I see value in, and it's not something that I think is good for my mental health. So I limit that, right? I keep it very limited to a very particular point of time. Or if they call, you know, I don't necessarily answer the call. I'll be like, oh, I'm busy, please send a text. So I can filter out if it's a genuine like question or concern that I need to address, or if it's something where they just kind of want to gossip, for example. So I think boundaries are very important, but I also think it's very important to take some time every once in a while to have a mental health day or a mental health hour or whatever it is, whether it be watching series, whether it be sleeping, whether it just be being. You know, this is something we don't do enough, especially because we have phones. We live in this age where there's constantly information and content always thrown at us. Do we ever just take a moment, put our phones completely off and aside, and just sit or just lay or just be? And I think that's something we could probably benefit from, because I don't think the human mind and the human psyche and human beings were meant to be constantly bombarded like this all the time. And I know at the beginning of this year, I took like a social media cleanse. So I couldn't delete my accounts because of the sort of public figure thing, but I just didn't post anything, and I didn't look. And in reality, I felt so good. I actually felt so good. So by the time I returned, I could also be like, well, I'm not going to engage in this toxic Twitter debate, you know? I don't gain value from it. So I'm going to leave it as such. So even negotiating with yourself on the mental health and emotional thing is important. And I think sometimes negotiating with yourself is maybe the hardest thing, because you're hardest on yourself as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Fasiha. I think I'm going to end it there. Thank you very much. That was incredibly valuable. I'm sure all the girls really gained something from it. Thank you very, very much for joining us once again. And I hope we see you again at future sessions as well. Thank you very much.
Definitely. Thank you.